Hi, welcome to my literary analysis on Pride and Prejudice. Well, sort of. Before formally digging into my analysis on the text, I wish to go into a couple things to help prime us for the journey ahead. In this video, we're going to look at what was going on in history around the time Austen was writing. Pride and Prejudice's life began in the 1790s, initially called First Impression. Under that original title, a version of the story was completed somewhere between October 1796 and August 1797. First Impression was then submitted for publication in November of 1797 and thankfully turned down. I say thankfully because the years in between helped to alter and strengthen the story into the masterpiece we know it today. Now, before I get into the meat of this video essay, I just want to say if you're seeing my eyes dip down, it's because I'm trying to read the script I had taken the time to write for myself for this, and I haven't quite figured out a good system of being able to read the script and look at the camera. Hopefully, as I do more videos, I'll figure out a better system, but I apologize for this. So, in other news, let's dig in. Pride and Prejudice, as we know it, was formally published in 1813 following the success of Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811, which this is probably why we have this Mandela effect with modern readers that the story takes place solidly in the Regency era. In my opinion, though, I think it probably takes place somewhere in the 1800s when it was being rewritten but not formally published, since the Regency era didn't start till 1811. We also have to remember that Jane Austen was more so a Georgian lady. The Georgian era started with the first Hanoverian king, or King George I, in 1714 and ended approximately in 1837 when Queen Victoria came into power. The Regency era is actually nestled within the Georgian, taking place between 1811 and 1820. As many are probably aware, it was dubbed the Regency era because of this time George III was named the Prince Regent. In my opinion, Jane's nieces were more so Regency ladies than she and Cassandra ever were, being respectively 36 and 38 at the start of the Regency era. But this is something I plan on getting more into when I eventually do my literary analysis on Persuasion, seeing that the relationship between the Elliot sisters with the young Musgroves remind me a lot of Jane and Cassandra's with their nieces. The Georgian era into which Jane Austen was born into was characterized for Great Britain for its constant warfare abroad. However, it was also a transitional period. It saw the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the shift from Enlightenment to Romanticism trends in arts and philosophies, the first whispers of feminist and abolitionist concerns in Western Europe. So what was the differences between these two eras? What separates them? Well, in all honesty, not a whole lot. The differences between the cultures and sentimentality were more similar than, say, these two eras versus the Victorian. However, in my belief, Georgian was a transitional period that culminated into the Regency. In other words, the ideas and philosophies growing throughout the Georgian era built up to then become those found in Regency, and less in opposition to it. And in my opinion, before I can get into the obvious differences such as the clothes, I need to unpack such things as the philosophies during these eras to help to then understand why they chose these clothes or acted in the way that they did. Recently, I have become familiar with these two eras of philosophies. By no means am I an expert. I just wanted to educate myself a little bit more because I was working on a video essay for the Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. But also, heads up, I'm probably going to be looking at my script a little bit more because the philosophies are kind of dense. I want to make sure I am getting them across clearly. So just a heads up for this one. The period of time in which the Enlightenment took place was between the late 1600s and the early 1800s. The Enlightenment, which valued knowledge gained through rationalism and imperialism, was concerned with a range of social ideas and political ideals, such as natural law, liberty and progress, toleration and fraternity, constitutional government, and the formal separation of state and church. Notable figures of the time were those such as John Locke, who is most known for his theory of natural rights, particularly the idea that individuals have the inherent right to life, liberty, and property. His political philosophies influenced others such as Voltaire and Rousseau, or if you have read Susan Collins' books, you might recognize these men's philosophies in the opening epigraphs, such as in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. The central doctrines of the Enlightenment were focused on individual liberties, and this is something seen in another influential figure's works during this time, Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft's A Vindication for the Rights of Women was first published in 1792, right in the midst when Jane Austen was working on First Impressions, or later called Pride and Prejudice. In A Vindication for Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. She suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded on reason, which fits within the Enlightenment. And we see this influence in Pride and Prejudice with Lizzie Bennet. While Mr. Collins might praise Lizzie for her modesty and economy, features of the traditional wife more so founded in Fordyce's sermons, it is Mr. Darcy who praises her for her liveliness of her mind, or in other words, her how witty and intellectual she is. And Mr. Darcy is not the only one to appreciate Lizzie's intellect. Mr. Bennet also makes a comment on how Lizzie and Jane are his favorites because they have more sense to them, but Mr. Bennet is also commenting not only on the intellect, but also within the social ideas of sense and sensibility that was popular in that time, which I will go into more in a moment. But we see Wollstonecraft's sentiments reflected in Elizabeth's free spirit thanks to comments like this from Miss Bingley: an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. One could argue that Elizabeth Bennet embodies the ideas of the Enlightenment era with her individual freedom, doing what she wishes by breaking from decorum when she wanders through the countryside to visit her sick sister, or when she chooses to turn down Mr. Collins' offer despite her mother's protests and her family's future, and with her embodying Wollstonecraft's ideas of women, fitting into Wollstonecraft's claim that women are essential to the nation because they educate its children and because they could be companions to their husbands rather than mere wives. Instead of viewing women as ornaments to society or property to be traded in marriage, Wollstonecraft maintains that they are human beings deserving of the same fundamental rights as men. Wollstonecraft's Vindication for the Rights of Women was written in response to Fordyce's sermon. Remember the book that Mr. Collins attempted to read that one night to the group and Lydia kept interrupting? If Lizzie had married Mr. Collins or had not caused Mr. Darcy to undergo his transformation, she probably would have been just a mere wife. However, because of the journey both she and Mr. Darcy undergo, their marriage turns into more of companionship, partnership. The idea of companionship and marriage was something that grew in popularity during this era. If you care to know more about the changing views surrounding love and marriage from George into modern times, I highly recommend checking out Lucy Worsley's docuseries, A Very British Romance. Philosophers and scientists during the Enlightenment period widely circulated their ideas through meetings at scientific academies, Masonic lodges, literary salons, coffee houses, and in printed books, journals, and pamphlets. The ideas of the Enlightenment undermined the authority of the monarchy and religious officials and paved the way for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. A variety of the 19th century movements, including liberalism, socialism, and neoclassicalism, can trace their intellectual heritage or origins to the Enlightenment. And side note, the neoclassicalism should stand out because of the revival of the ancient and Greek, Roman mythology and culture greatly influenced the Regency era. But let's move on to the period of the Romanticism. And the Romanticism came about in response to the disillusionment of the Enlightenment era and the aftermath of the French Revolution. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant can readily be identified as one who kickstarted the Romantic Revolution, but it was the philosopher David Hume that took reason, which was a pillar of the Enlightenment, to its skeptical end. Hume showed that ultimately we know nothing. All we have are the perceptions of the senses, and there is no way to know if these perceptions correspond to any outside world, whether it be the physical world of time and space or any transcendent realm of spirit. In fact, there are no way of knowing if there are any reality outside our sense of perception. I know, rather bleak, but the bleakness was reflected in the arts of the time. Poetry went through a golden age with the rise of romantic such as Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, William Blake, and John Keats. Shelley's wife Mary wrote the first and finest science fiction with her horror story Frankenstein. Meanwhile, the music of Beethoven and Bach and Mozart made its way from the continent to England. The standard of food and fashion skyrocketed, the latter bringing an acceptance towards informal and practical dress, and a new Gothic architectural movement was developed. The Romantic thinkers began to feel that the Enlightenment was suffocating them and squeezing the spirit, passion, and morality out of existence. Kant, in response, created a new vision of reality. He rejected the universe of the universal laws that could be discovered and instead envisioned a growing universe that was created in part by human choices and will. The Enlightenment saw a universe that was mechanical and run by fixed laws. The Romantics saw a universe that was organic and grew in accord with acts of will. Human will and freedom were for them sacred, where the Enlightenment had held human reason and rationality in the highest regard. Nature was also a big component of the arts during this era because it reflected the core of their ideology. All that from the Romanticism era we can see being reflected in Jane Austen's works. Not only is she known for having wild, untamed nature as a component in her stories, but Austen is known for being a master at understanding humanity. Her characters, while sometimes silly, feel very real. We recognize a similarity in characters such as Mrs. Bennet, Mary Crawford, or Mr. Elton in real-life people today. We see Austen reflect human will and freedom as being sacred when it comes to her characters' choices such as Lizzie turning down Mr. Collins. But it's also Austen poking at the tension between the Enlightenment's reason and rationality with the Romanticism's human will and freedom, with scenes such as Lydia running off with Mr. Wickham. Actually, I gotta hold off myself back kind of like because there's so much I can unpack here that I've decided I'm going to save that for a different video because there's just so much there I can do. Now, you might be thinking that I'm trying to shoehorn Jane Austen's stories to fit within the philosophies of the time and that Jane did not intend to comment on them while she was writing, but that's where I think you're wrong. Now, obviously, we don't know what Jane was thinking during her writing process since it's not like it's written down, but we do know that she grew up in a very academic home. Her father, while being a cleric, also took in additional pupils to have an additional income. So I guarantee there were heated debates about these budding philosophers. And we also know that Jane was very sad when they had to sell off a lot of the books from their vast collection when her father had finally retired and they left their childhood home in Steventon for Bath. So there is a strong likelihood that Jane was very much aware of the debates going on around her and wonderfully contextualized it within her stories, just as Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein. With all this now in mind, let us use these two philosophies to unpack how they affected other areas of culture and also Jane Austen's stories. Sorry for the outfit change. I thought I could finish more of this before I had to go to a birthday party, and I was sadly wrong. So it's a new day, new outfit, new lighting because I think it's about to rain. But let's jump back in with sense versus sensibility. This honestly is one of my favorite fun fact topics that many people have the misfortune of hearing me ramble about whenever they bring up Jane Austen around me. But Sense and Sensibility is more than just a title of one of Jane Austen's stories. It's a societal phenomenon that encouraged people to act in a certain way. So while I am starting this literary analysis with Pride and Prejudice, the ideas behind Sense and Sensibility can be felt in all of Jane Austen's stories, including Pride and Prejudice. Here's see why. The idea of sensibility can first be found within John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, so the concept is founded within the Enlightenment period. But it was George Cheyne and other medical writers who talked about the English malady, or hysteria in women and hypochondria in men, a condition with symptoms that closely resembled the modern diagnosis of clinical depression. Cheyne considered this malady to be the result of overtaxed nerves. At the same time, theorists asserted that the individual who had ultra-sensitive nerves would have a keener sense and thus be more aware of beauty and moral truth. Thus, while it was considered a physical and/or emotional fragility, sensibility was also widely perceived as a virtue. Do you see now where I'm connecting it with Pride and Prejudice? Doesn't its characterization fit within Mrs. Bennet? Which makes sense, unironically, since Mrs. Bennet is solidly a Georgian lady, whereas her daughters are kind of like Jane Austen in the sense that they're kind of on the cusp between Georgian and Regency. But in the masculine form of hypochondria, we see that illustrated with Emma's Mr. Woodhouse. Another term for sensibility is sentimentalism, and I'm going to be reading off my script a little bit again because I just want to make sure I get these ideas across clearly. So sentimentalism in philosophy and sentimentalism in literature are sometimes hard to distinguish. As the philosophical arguments developed, the literature soon tried to emulate by putting the philosophical into practice through narration and characters. As a result, it is common to observe both philosophical and literary movements simultaneously. Philosophically, sentimentalism was often contrasted to rationalism. While the 18th century rationalism corresponded itself with the development of the analytic mind as a basis for acquiring truth, Sentimentalism hinged upon an intrinsic human capacity to feel and how this leads to truth. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune is in want of a wife. The very opening line of Pride and Prejudice feels as though it's straddling these two concepts of rationalism and the intrinsic human capacity to feel. Mrs. Bennet's nerves are often overwrought throughout the course of this book, and she may come across as silly, but her motivations are grounded in rationalism. The need to survive and survival for her and her daughters is based on good marriage. So Mrs. Bennet's role in this fits with the two because her motivation is rational, fitting with the old ideas, but her outward actions come across as more sentimentalism with an overwrought nerves and a lot of feeling involved in this situation. Sentimentalism asserted that overshown feelings was not a weakness, but rather showed up one to be a moral person. Around the middle of the century, sentimentalism set untouched nature against courtly civilization, as in the works of Rousseau, which, side note, you'll probably recognize the name because, for example, Catherine the Great cites him a lot in the show The Great, but you would have learned about him in one of your history classes, and he is also, I believe, one of the philosophers that Susan Collins uses in her epigraphs in one of her books. But in addition to Rousseau, Samuel Richardson's sentimental epistolary novel, which means that it's in the form of letters, the novel is called Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, which tells you a lot, was published in 1740, was a great literary influence. The best way for me to describe it is that it's the equivalent of like all of us getting very excited for the new episode of Game of Thrones, because the book was released in increments, kind of like Charles Dickens would release chapter by chapter. So the public was ravenous for the next installment, that when we eventually get to the marriage at the end, there were tales of like churches across England ringing the bells in celebration. So it was very popular at the time. But the literary work often featured scenes of distress and tenderness, and the plot was arranged to advance emotions rather than action. The result was a valorization of fine feelings, displaying the characters as a model for refined moral and emotional effect. Sentimentalism in literature is also often used as a medium through which authors could promote their own agendas, imploring readers to emphasize with the problems they are dealing with. Jane Austen's 1811 Sense and Sensibility provides a more familiar example of this reaction against excess of feelings, especially those associated with women. It is a conversation that, being one extreme, the too rational like Eleanor who embodies sense, or the other, the overly emotional Marianne who embodies the idea of sensibility, can both be detrimental to one's happiness and health. And this conversation continues in Pride and Prejudice with Lizzie, who is praised by her father for her good sense when compared to her mother, or Lydia, who embodies the ideas of sentimentalism. Besides that, we see it in how Lizzie's conversation about poetry, which perfectly embodies the idea of sentimentalism with its overly emotional, flowery writing, that is also commented on by Anne Elliot in Persuasion, with Captain Wentworth's depressed friend who overly indulges in poetry and is moping and not moving on in his life. In this era, both men and women were encouraged to dip into their emotions and to express them. They were often considered soft and swoony, so some contemporaries at the time did make fun of these men and women, but it was with the Victorians that we see a huge swing away from sentimentalism. Instead, the Victorians revived Arthurian legends and centered their culture and romantic etiquette around chivalrous knights. Medieval knights were expected to be strong, but also gentle and polite. They were supposed to be manly. Chivalry was basically romance, but for men. Knights would pay homage and then go off to do grand deeds, and you can learn more about this particular conversation in A Very British Romance documentary by Lucy Worsley, which was initially aired in 2015, but you can find it online. AKA, men were to be men and not like the Regency fops who sometimes bordered on being a tad silly with their obsessiveness over their hair and dress and jewelry and emotions. Great examples of these foppish men, or at least caricatures of these kind of men, can be found in Georgette Harris' books, I found. But Jane Austen also pokes fun at these men with her characterization of Frank Churchill, who at one point was wearing two waistcoats at once. At the end of this section, the reason why I wanted to get into the ideas of sense and sensibility is to give a basic understanding of the way the society in Jane's lifetime was acting and the conversations being had. All this so then I can pinpoint during my dissection of Pride and Prejudice specific moments of sense and sensibility and how they're influencing the characters and their reactions and interactions. As I've mentioned previously, the Georgian era into which Jane Austen was born was characterized by constant warfare abroad, mostly with France, but the wars affected England's society during this time period, and we see its effects being reflected in Jane Austen's works. The most obvious example of the effects of the war on society was how society viewed its military men. It's almost comical how commonplace the idea of being a military man or going into the military or having a family member in the military can be found in contemporary historical fiction and historical romances. It became sort of a trope of the genre now. Meanwhile, for Jane Austen, its presence in her stories was just because that's what life was like for her during that time. Also, she would be very aware of the war since two of her brothers were in the Navy. While the Navy may have played a bigger role in her other stories such as Persuasion and Mansfield Park, we see instead the militia in Pride and Prejudice, which, to clarify, the militia can be compared more so to the National Guard. They were a group of men that were not sent on duty outside of the country. Instead, they were tasked with protecting against invasion since Napoleon was menacing the English coastlines, and for upholding laws and order in the land since there was no formal law enforcement in the area outside local magistrates, which the magistrates would be men such as Mr. Knightley. And when the militia was active, the law required that they be quartered and billeted in inns, livery stables, alehouses, and all houses of persons selling brandy, strong waters, ciders, wines, and metheglin, which is mead by retail, and this is quoted within the statutes of UK and Ireland in 1813. These establishments were compensated the rates comparable or corresponding to the ranks of the militiamen they housed. While not part of the landed gentry, which was the usual qualification to be an officer, Wickham would have been welcome because officers were hard to come by, and Wickham was universally educated and had the appearance of a gentleman with charm to match. But there is a more nefarious side to the military. Like how Wickham outwardly could be described as such by Lizzie when she says, Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt that she had neither been seeing him before nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of the Shire were in general a very credible gentleman-like set, and the best of them were of the present party, but Mr. Wickham was as far beyond them all in persons, countenance, air, and walk. However, inwardly we discover the nefarious side of Mr. Wickham, or as Lizzie says when comparing Wickham with Darcy, one has got all the goodness and the other all the appearance of it. That was exactly what was going on with Britain's military at the time. As Professor Gillian Russell describes in her book, The Theaters of War, Performance, Politics, and Society, the camp seemed a theater of social and sexual interchange. The militia was making love, not war, or as the heroine in Coxheath Camp, which was a novel formatted as a series of letters published in 1779, said, General officers and cadets, duchesses and demoiselles, are alike exposed to the snares of beauty, are alike susceptible to the tender passion. There were numerous reports of this time of leading ladies to societies having affairs with the military men, and the militia's reputation after these scandals would be more at risk its effects on English ladies' virtues than the threat on Frenchmen' lives. Like Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, a soldier pushed away from his home district was free from those who knew him and his reputation. His very identity was changed. He was now an officer by title, and his previous self and his social status was covered by his gaudy regimental dress. But his rank might well have been earned not by experience on the battlefield or the parade ground, but by influence. In the shiny uniforms masked a variety of characters and origins. Men got commissions in the local militia without needing ever to have owned a residence in the area. Thus, they could acquire social status regardless of merit or their reputation among those who knew their worth. It was perhaps the corrupting effect of this unearned social status that Jane Austen feared in her brother, Henry. In 1796, he tried to obtain a position in the Oxfordshire Regiment, and when he was unsuccessful, he tried again in the 86th. In January 1796, Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra, I heartily hope that he will, as usual, be disappointed in this scheme. It was possibly the dangers that sojourning posed to the character and the finances rather than those posed to the health that she had in mind. But yet, as we see with the members of Meriton, there is this allure and gentility and honor blanketing the militia. The militia was given an air of knighthood. While the nation found knightly pretensions on its soldier, prince, and dukes, it also found sexual and financial corruption. In 1808, a great scandal broke upon Regency Britain, and the Duke of York, now the commander-in-chief of the army, was at its center. York's mistress, the longtime courtesan Anna Clark, had been accepting bribes from army officers seeking promotion. To supplement the inadequate allowances that her royal lover gave her, she accepted cash, in return for which the Duke arranged rapid advancement for the officer concerned. It was also alleged that she, as well as Sterling, accepted sexual favors from the most eligible soldiers. One has got all the goodness and the other the appearance of it. The duplicity found within the militia can be perfectly encompassed within the character of Mr. Welcome. Outwardly, he presented himself as genteel and all things perfectly honorable, but inwardly, he was later exposed for being a fortune-hunting, immoral man that he was. So I think that one of Jane Austen's intent of using the militia within the Pride and Prejudice is to have a conversation about morality and appearance. And let's not forget that the original title of the work was First Impressions. And every aspect of the story, you feel the repercussions of characters' first impressions, whether it was good or bad. I am so sorry about the continuity of this video. I thought I could finish recording before my hair appointment, and obviously that was not the case, but we're jumping right back in with the militia, because I think the other thing that Austen might have been doing with the militia, and even with her clerics, was creating a foil between the women and this particular sect of men. And we see it, for example, illustrated with Lizzie's comment to her Aunt Gardner in regards to Lydia's reaction to Mr. Wickham courting Miss King and her fortune, when she says, "They are young in the ways of the world and not yet open to the mortifying conviction that handsome young men must have something to live on as well as the plain." As we see in Jane Austen's works, the military offered an opportunity for men to socially and economically climb. Most obvious example is Captain Wentworth from Persuasion, but even Wickham in Pride and Prejudice shows how it's an honorable occupation for a son of a gentleman or a gentlemanly man to pursue. Think of how welcoming and kindly the people of Meryton accepted the military men into their communities and their homes when you compare it to the reactions we see with the Bingley sisters in regards to the Bennet's aunt and uncle who live in Cheapside working as a lawyer. Being a lawyer was respectable, but seemingly a step below gentility when it compared to men who become clerics and military. And yet, despite having more freedom and agency to earn one's living, marriage was still the fastest and best way to improve one's standing, or bring one down, as illustrated with Fanny Price's parents' marriage when compared to the youngest sister who married a baronet. But Jane Austen shows that there's a multitude of what marriages could represent, whether it was to uphold societal expectations, such as with Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas, or financial, in the terms of Mr. and Mrs. Elton and Emma, or a place in society like how Caroline Bingley desires to marry Mr. Darcy partially comes from a place where if they did marry, it means their family has made it, since they are still rather new to their social economic standing. But through her stories, we see how marriage is used as a form of currency to help or hinder both genders. To sum up what I'm trying to say, the military men and like the clerics that we see throughout Austen's works, like Mr. Collins and Mr. Elton and Edmund Bertram, they are almost on equal standing as the genteel women of the stories. Their existence and livelihood are dependent on the charity of others too. Most of the time, the officer's place was bought by a family member, whether it's by a father, a brother, or an uncle, like in the case of Fanny Price's brother in Mansfield Park, who's in the Navy, or even Mr. Wickham's place being bought by technically Mr. Darcy's money. But part of the plot in Mansfield Park is that Fanny Price's brother is stuck in his current position until he can either raise enough money or someone else bought him a higher rank. A similar thing is occurring with the clerics in the Austen stories. They had to hope to find the opportunity and to be recommended for an opening at a good parish. We hear endlessly of Mr. Collins' gratefulness to Lady Catherine de Bourgh's patronage. We also see how Edmund Bertram is stuck since his family's rectory is not available, and the size of a parish dictated their income. So for these men, marriage was the best opportunity to gain more money and or prestige. This is the same situation for the women. If one is unmarried or widowed, They are dependent on the charity of their friends and family. We see this showcased with the Bates and Emma or the Dashwoods in Sense and Sensibility. Even Charlotte Lucas points it out with her currently popular speech from the movies. I am 27 years old. I have no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents, and I am frightened. But marriage offered the opportunity to potentially gain some individual and financial freedom or even prestige, just as it does for this particular sect of men. So it's interesting that 3 out of the 4 suitors for Lizzie fit within this sect. Like Collins is a cleric, and both Wickham and Colonel Fitzwilliam are military men. And also she feels the most comfortable and immediately as equals to these 3 men when compared to how she acts around Bingley and Mr. Darcy. While she is still herself, she does seem to be putting on more manners around them, even when she doesn't like them. Whereas as with these 3 men, you see her relaxing from decorum more. In summary for this section, the malicious presence in Pride and Prejudice is there in part because they were extremely prevalent in the day-to-day life in Austen's lifetime. It would be odd not to have them as even background characters when the war was actively going on for England and it was a major focus on the society at large. But they also offer Austen a wonderful opportunity to comment on morality and appearance and marriage and social standing. She took aspects of everyday life for an average person, or at least more average than the nobility, and used it to comment on broad ideas like marriage and power and freedom and wealth, while simultaneously making it feel almost commonplace. Like her stories still have morality to them, but they are more subtle than some of her contemporaries. With this video, I'm just barely scratching the surface on what was occurring in history at the time that Austen was writing, and how these events in history found their way into her stories. The topics I covered today, though only scratching the surface, are ones that I think are very important to be aware of walking into my literary analysis of Pride and Prejudice. There obviously is more I can talk about, and I will probably talk about in the future, whether it is when I'm actively reading and dissecting the book or in a separate addendum videos. But for me, I felt we should at least have a baseline understanding of the era the story is taking place in, and the philosophies of the era, what aspect of the social etiquette, and a little bit about the militia, to then be able to understand the characters and their actions in the story, and to be able to dig deeper into the minutiae of it when specific moments pop up in the book. However, if you want to know more about Jane Austen and the history she lived through, I can recommend books such as Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley, or Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Atkins, or even the podcast The Thing About Austen, which brings on experts to talk about very niche aspects of Austen's world and stories. There are probably a handful of YouTube videos dedicated to the history. I can definitely attest that there are plenty of academic papers, many of which I am steadily working my way through for this analysis. So I encourage anyone who wishes to learn more to go check these out. And finally, I hope that you will like this video and subscribe so then you can be notified when I finally start posting my videos doing the analysis of Pride and Prejudice. Until then, thank you for watching.